Ever since humans realized they could stick rocks down a tube and blast it back out by lighting spicy dirt on fire, we've been trying to figure out better ways to do it. I want to look at some of the guns made over the centuries that had odd or unique designs and features to them, and in some cases kept them from standing the test of time. A lot of these guns might look silly and weird in retrospect, but that's also because many of the designs I'm going to look at were bold, innovative, and in many cases had never been done before or since. Obviously, I can't talk about every minute engineering design behind every single gun ever made, so forgive me if I don't mention a certain gun because there's a lot out there. What I want to focus on are the guns that were unique, that were cutting edge, and that were the first or only of their kind. And it's important to remember that not all of these guns were necessarily bad, and some of them were actually quite popular and well liked, but for one reason or another went against more conventional firearm engineering concepts. A lot of these guns were designed with a specific purpose or application in mind, and a lot more were made simply as a proof of concept, but as you'll see, that didn't always work out in their favor. It's also worth mentioning that just because a gun may not have been very popular or was very rare, doesn't mean it's necessarily weird. There have been thousands of guns made over the years that followed common design concepts or borrowed from other successful firearms, but didn't see a lot of use or wide-scale production. Obscurity or low production numbers doesn't necessarily mean weird, and neither does the look of the gun. There are many guns that might look different or odd on the outside, but still function in a pretty standard way. If I were to cover every single different bullpup ever made, for example, then we'd be here for weeks. Now sure, the look of a bullpup gun is definitely different from your standard assault rifle, but aside from the trigger being relocated in front of the action, a lot of bullpups keep to conventional engineering concepts. So if you see things like bullpups or top-fed rifles or side-loading submachine guns on this Iceberg, keep in mind that it's for more reasons than just the trigger and magazine being in a different spot. I designed this Iceberg entirely from the ground up and placed each gun on its respective level based on a lot of different factors. I accounted for things like the age of the gun, its production numbers, how unique or unconventional its design is, how many countries have used it in their military or police forces, and even how prevalent it's been in media like movies or video games. Obviously, what classifies as weird is entirely subjective, and while many of these guns might at least be familiar or recognizable to a lot of people, I'd wager that not everyone realizes how or why they're special. This entire Iceberg is going to cover almost 300 guns in total, so I'm going to be breaking it down into multiple videos where I explore one level of the Iceberg each, and then eventually I'll make a supercut where it's all compiled into one. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to a few other channels, those being Forgotten Weapons, Sea and Arsenal, and Cap and Ball. The work that these channels do to educate people about weird, old, and obscure firearms is incredible, and this video literally couldn't have happened without them. I'm not affiliated with them at all, but I use their channels for a lot of my research, so if you haven't followed them already and you're interested in learning about this kind of stuff, then you should definitely check them out. I also need to give a shout out to Louis the Fox 1997, who created the assault rifle Iceberg, which I have linked below. His Iceberg covers a whole bunch of rifles, both well-known and more uncommon, and includes rifles with both traditional and more standard designs, as well as more unconventional and unique designs. It also only covers assault rifles, so while his list has a lot of the same guns I'll be mentioning, they may not all be placed at the same levels, and I'll also be talking about shotguns and pistols and so on. I'm really excited for this video, so without wasting any more time, we're going to get started with the first level of the Weird Gun Iceberg. So level 1 is basically all the guns that the average person with a basic knowledge of firearms might be able to think of off the top of their head. Guns that both respectable gun tubers and shameless content farms have covered, and many that appear on almost every top 10 weird guns list that shows up in a Google search. These are all pieces that are pretty prevalent, somewhat well known, and are more common knowledge to even the most basic of gun aficionados. Now let's start off with the classic, the Blunderbuss. Many of you are probably familiar with the Blunderbuss, but for those of you that aren't, it's essentially a large-barreled, smoothbore gun that you could dump powder and a whole bunch of flak into and blast it back out in a wide radius. The Blunderbuss saw a lot of use as a close-quarters weapon with cavalrymen, coach guards, and naval soldiers, and the ammunition that was primarily used was obviously lead shot, but there are many accounts of people shooting all kinds of things out of a blunderbuss, including rocks, scrap metal, and even just splinters of wood. Like I said, they were very popular as close quarters defense weapons, and so you saw them a lot on ships and stagecoaches, and they're probably one of the most iconic weapons of pirate lore. Obviously, contact weapons were the primary means of battle for centuries, and for a long time, guns were relegated to specialty applications or served as secondary weapons or accessories for high-level officers and aristocrats. Now, one of the ways that some weaponsmiths tried to integrate guns into a more practical application was to combine them with other weapons like an axe, a sword, or a mace. A lot of these sort of guns come from around the 1600s and 1700s, and it's more than likely that most of these are one-of-a-kind pieces, as their obviously unique look and ornate design is pretty indicative that they were most likely custom jobs for someone with an expensive and eccentric taste in weaponry. One of the most unique examples of this concept is a German hunting sword that is currently on display at the Met Museum and is dated to about 1730. It uses a wheel-lock action mounted to a massive blade engraved with calendar markings, and as with a lot of customized work from the early days of firearms, this is most likely made by hand and is one of only about 4 pieces like this. Germans were weirdly very fond of sword guns for deer hunting, and this kind of stuff would have showed up a lot back in the day. Now, during the days of early firearms, loading them was incredibly tedious and time-consuming, making it even more difficult to do under the stress of a life-or-death situation, especially if you had to deal with multiple targets. And since practical and reliable guns capable of holding multiple shots were a ways off, there were 2 main solutions that gained prevalence. One option was to just carry more guns, but that obviously adds extra weight and takes up extra room, so the other option was to have a single gun that could hold multiple shots by adding extra barrels, triggers, and firing mechanisms. These sort of guns varied widely in design and application, but most were intended for use in self-defense or simply as a novelty. These guns could be built with anything from just having 2 barrels to having a fully rotating system made up of individual firing mechanisms, but some of these designs got a little crazy. And while most multi-barrel guns were designed to fire a single round at a time, guns like a Duckfoot Pistol fired several rounds out of several barrels all at once. Now, don't do anything within a 30-degree angle that you'd regret. Its name comes from the multiple barrels spread out in an obvious resemblance to the webbed foot of a duck. While a Duckfoot pistol basically just blasted lead in a radial spread in front of you, I wouldn't necessarily call it an early form of a shotgun, because that distinction goes to the Blunderbuss I just mentioned, and a piece called the knock gun that I'll talk about later on in this Iceberg. As gun technology developed into the 1700s, many firearms started popping up that experimented with ways to hold and fire multiple rounds in a reliable and practical way. One of the best examples is the Pepperbox Revolver, which used a hand-operated revolving cylinder of several barrels that were each loaded and primed individually. They were mainly marketed and sold for civilian use, but also saw some application with militaries being used as personal arms for officers or as experimental carbines. The technology of the Pepperbox was improved and refined over time, eventually leading to the earliest true revolvers in the 1800s. Now, during times of war, it's common for groups of soldiers to either be on the move a lot or positioned in an area that limits their access to certain luxuries. But all the same, they need to keep themselves going, and even though adequate rest isn't always an option, many try to make up for it with copious amounts of caffeine. And while instant coffee comes standard in a lot of MRE kits used by the military today, soldiers during the Civil War weren't so lucky. But in 1864, Lieutenant Colonel Walter King of the 4th Missouri State Militia Cavalry Regiment came up with the idea of letting soldiers make coffee on the go by installing a hand-crank coffee grinder into the buttstock of the Army's standard-issue rifle at the time, the .52 caliber Sharps. The idea of the coffee mill Sharps was, as far as I could determine, nothing more than just a fun proof of concept, and many historians believe that less than 100 authentic models were ever made, with some records claiming that only around 8 were actually built. Many of the coffee mill Sharps rifles you'll see on the market today are almost guaranteed to be reproductions made long after the Civil War, since the novelty of the gun interested a lot of collectors, and lots of people started retrofitting other Sharps rifles into coffee grinders to sell them off. But I'm sure you're all wondering, how well did it actually grind coffee? Well, according to the director of the Springfield Armory Museum in Massachusetts, not too well. The Armory has one of the few verified original coffee mill rifles, and over several different demonstrations, they've concluded that the rifle will definitely grind coffee, but not exactly well enough to provide an enjoyable cup of joe. Innovation has always been a driving force behind the advancement of firearms technology, and in the early days of the Cold War and space race, the technology being developed to send men to the moon was also being used to send slugs downrange. The Gyrojet was an experimental series of weapons developed in the 1960s by American inventors Robert Mainhart and Art Beal. Rather than firing traditional bullets out of a brass casing filled with gunpowder, the Gyrojet worked by blasting a gyroscopically stabilized rocket projectile called a microjet, which had a low muzzle velocity when first being fired that would quickly pick up speed as it traveled. The rounds packed a pretty decent punch, had very little recoil, and didn't require a heavy-duty built gun to fire out of, and several different iterations of the Gyrojet were produced. Now that said, the guns were rather unreliable and cumbersome to use, so they never really made it out of the experimental phase. Gyrojets were produced in very limited numbers, with very few of them still existing today. They can go for several $1,000s on the market, with the microjet rounds alone costing more than $200 each. The Gyrojet is inherently a very cool concept, albeit pretty impractical, but they've secured their legacy as an iconic weird gun from the space age that is instantly recognizable and has gone on to inspire several fictional weapons like the Bolter from the 40K universe. The Fallschirmjägergewehr 42 was a battle rifle developed during World War II by German designer Louis Stange. The name literally translates to Paratrooper Rifle 42, and as you can imagine, it was designed for use by German paratroopers. It was intended to bridge the gap between light machine guns and standard issue rifles, giving airborne infantry a reliable multi-purpose weapon. While being a lot bulkier than a standard 98K that most German soldiers used, it was considerably lighter and definitely shorter than the MG43, and coupled with a select fire capability, the FG42 was a perfectly competent option and a great alternative to a simple bolt-action rifle. The FG42 has often been labeled as one of the most advanced weapons of World War II, and many of its design features were copied by the US military when developing the M60 machine gun. The straight-line recoil and side-loading magazine gave the FG42 a center of gravity that was level with the barrel itself, making it incredibly stable and easy to shoot. And the top of the receiver had locking lever scope mounts, meaning that different optics could be quickly swapped around depending on the scenario that the shooter found himself in. The FG42 obviously saw a few design upgrades over time and saw some limited use during the latter part of the war, and while not quite as iconic as other German weapons from that era, it's one of my personal favorites. In the early 2000s, the US military wanted to explore the possibility of developing a next-gen service rifle to replace the M16, and this project was called the Objective Individual Combat Weapons Program, or the OICW. The whole idea behind this program was to create a multi-purpose gun that had the capabilities of a standard assault rifle and a programmable airburst grenade launcher. The program led to a lot of interesting designs, which I'll talk about as we move further down the iceberg, but one of the most recognizable guns to come out of the OICW program was the H&K XM8. It was originally designed to be the rifle portion of H&K's submission to the program, but the grenade launcher / rifle combo that they came up with didn't really meet the standards set by the US military, leading them to separate the weapon into two individual guns, those being the XM25 grenade launcher and the XM8 assault rifle. The XM8 has a lot of similar design cues with the more successful G36, and for a while it was being considered to be the new standard issue assault rifle for US forces until test trials started revealing several glaring flaws. For one, the gun is largely built of composite plastics save for the barrel and a few internal parts, and while that makes the gun more lightweight while still staying pretty resistant to wear and tear, the gun will literally start to melt after enough sustained fire. The XM8 also came with a built-in digital optic that had a pretty short battery life, and coupled with a proprietary magazine that was incompatible with Stanag magazines, the rifle just wasn't a practical option for US forces, and its experimental use came to a halt in 2005. However, the XM8 got a bit of a second chance thanks to the Pasukan Kas Laut of Malaysia. The Pascal is the Naval Special Warfare Forces of the Malaysian military, serving a very similar purpose to the US Navy SEALs. They use a lot of different weapons made by H&K and are one of, if not the only military forces actually using the XM8 today. While a lot of guns were obviously produced with practicality in mind, many others have been made over the years simply for the novelty. An excellent example of this is the 2mm Kolibri Pistol. This tiny handgun gets its name from the German word for a hummingbird, and it is notable for being the smallest centerfire cartridge ever made. For context, a centerfire cartridge like the 9mm has a primer that is a separate component from the brass casing as opposed to a rimfire like the 22, which ignites powder by striking the hollow edge of the brass casing on the bottom. These are the two most common types of ammunition, with most small caliber rounds being developed as rimfires, making the 2mm Kolibri not only a cool gimmick, but an impressive feat of engineering. The gun was designed by Austrian watchmaker Franz Fahnel and was marketed as a ladies' defense pistol that could easily be carried in a small handbag or coin pouch. Now, despite its diminutive size, the Kolibri pistol operates in a pretty standard blowback mechanism like many other handguns, although its barrel is so ridiculously tiny that no tools could be used to cut rifling grooves into it, making it an incredibly inaccurate smoothbore. The entirety of the gun is laughably small, to the point that many people had to use tweezers just to operate it, and the puny 2mm round it fires has a velocity of just around 600 feet per second at only 3 foot-pounds of energy, so you'd likely do more damage by just throwing the gun at somebody than you would by actually shooting them with it. But the idea of a small self-defense gun that could easily fit in the palm of your hands is one that's been around for a while, and before the design of compact pistols became more or less standardized, a lot of interesting designs came and went. An excellent example of this is the Turbiaux Palm-Squeezer, which was specifically designed to be held not just in the shooter's hand, but actually within the shooter's closed fist. Also called the disc pistol or simply just the protector, the Turbiaux was a turret-style revolver that held ammunition in a disc with the rounds facing outwards in a circular fashion that could house anywhere from 6 to 10 rounds, which compared to other super compact guns of the day like single-shot Derringers was a pretty decent advantage. Now, rather than a traditional trigger, the Turbiaux was fired simply by squeezing it in your hands, which depressed a sort of paddle on the back of the gun that ran the double-action firing mechanism. Obviously, the design doesn't account for sights, but the gun was intended to be fired at point-blank range anyway, so it didn't really matter. Palm-Squeezer guns were produced by a few different companies between the 1800s and early 1900s, but the closest thing to a successful production run was from the Chicago Firearms Company. Peter Finnegan bought the patent of the gun for the company in 1892 and then contracted the Ames Sword Company to actually produce around 15,000 of them in preparation for the upcoming Chicago World's Fair, but they were only able to make about 1,500 in time. A legal battle between Chicago Arms and Ames took place afterwards, and after settling the case, about 12,000 more were produced in total before the design was abandoned. Remington later took up the design until 1920, and since then no more Palm-Squeezer guns have been made. Now, the idea behind the gun and its incredibly unique design really makes it stand out, making it one of the most iconic weird guns ever made. Now, tiny pocket guns that could fit in the palm of one's hand weren't exactly a niche concept for folks wanting some protection in the 1800s. But with small, low-powered, and low-capacity guns, the question arises of what to do if you run out of ammo or, God forbid, your shots don't stop your attacker. Well, for inventor James Reed, the obvious solution was to just punch them if shooting them didn't work. And to this idea, Reed created the My Friend Revolver, a small 22 caliber pepperbox pistol that could double as a knuckle duster if the need arose. In most respects, the gun operated like a normal single-action revolver, albeit on a very scaled-down level, but the gun's reduced size was mostly due to its lack of a barrel protruding past the cylinder or a grip protruding past the index and middle finger. The knuckle duster revolver was provided in 22, 32, and 41 caliber variants, but the 22 was the most successful gun produced by James Reed, who sold over 10,000 of them at $10 each from 1868 to 1882. However, economic struggles in 1883 caused Reed to cease production and close the company, but he continued to work as a gunsmith for the U.S. Arsenal afterwards. Today, many of his knuckle duster revolvers can still be found at auctions or collector sites, and they go for about 200% more than their original price. Another incredibly small revolver that's actually been the source of some discrepancy is simply just called the ring gun, which, as the name would imply, is an incredibly small revolver entirely built onto a ring that can be worn on the user's finger. They fire an incredibly small and underpowered 4 or 5 millimeter pinfire round and operate on a manually rotated single-action pepperbox style cylinder. Pinfire was one of the short-lived cartridge styles used in places like France during the 1800s that used casings with a small brass pin protruding from the side to ignite the powder. Due to the ring gun's use of this ammunition type and its inherently steampunk-looking design, many have incorrectly assumed that the ring guns were a somewhat common item in the 1800s, but they were in fact not even created until the 20th century as a novelty collector's item. Many different militaries and governments have used guns to take out all sorts of targets over the years, but sometimes brandishing a weapon draws far too much attention, which has led to the development of many different types of secret assassination devices, or simply spy guns. There's obviously been a lot of different designs, all of them unique, but many of them are in concept just making a gun look like something that's not a gun. Briefcase MP5s, single-shot pistols hidden inside a flashlight case or a tube of lipstick, a .22 that folds out to look like a regular pen, and perhaps most well-known, a .38 caliber fist gun mounted to a leather glove. Most spy guns were obviously intended to be used discreetly, leaving little that could indicate where, how, or from whom the shot had come from. One of the craziest examples of this was the heart attack gun developed during the Cold War. It shot a small, needle-like projectile made of ice infused with shellfish toxin that would melt and seep into the bloodstream and induce a heart attack before denaturing and leaving almost no traces in the target aside from a small red dot that could easily pass off as a bug bite. Now, I couldn't figure out exactly when the heart attack gun was actually built or if the CIA actually used it aside from testing, but its existence was confirmed during the 1975 Church Committee hearing to investigate abuses by the U.S. Government Intelligence Agency.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman. The round thing at the top is obviously the sight. The rest of it is what is practically a normal .45, although it's special. However, it works by electricity. There's a battery in the handle, and it fires a small dart.
So that when it fires silently?
Almost silently, yes. Very little.
What range does it have?
100 meters. 100 meters, I believe, about 100 yards, 100 meters.
About 100 meters range.
Right.
And the dart itself, when it strikes the target, does the target know that he's been hit and about to die?
That depends, Mr. Chairman, on the particular dart used. There are different kinds of these flechettes that were used in various weapon systems, and a special one was developed which potentially would be able to enter the target without perception.
Without perception?
Right.
And did you find such darts in the library?
We did.
In the laboratory?
We did.
Yes. Isn't it true, too, that the effort not only involved designing a gun that could strike a human target without knowledge of the person who'd been struck, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Well, there was an attempt.
Or the dart?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit.
Now, this was obviously just one example of how the US government was creating all sorts of new and experimental weapons during the Cold War, since the entire nature of warfare was changing with all the new technology and tactics being developed in the post-World War II era. And for every secret gun nobody is supposed to know about that leaves no trace of its existence, there's always a giant recoilless rifle that launches miniature nuclear bombs. Yes, the US military actually built the Fat Man launcher from Fallout. Obviously, the Davy Crockett launcher wasn't exactly the same as the Fat Man, but it, at least in concept, served the same purpose, which was a relatively compact, semi-portable artillery weapon that could be quickly deployed to launch a low-yield nuclear warhead capable of delivering explosive damage equivalent to 20 tons of TNT and deadly ionizing radiation to anything within 500 feet of the blast. The Davy Crockett is a unique example of an experimental weapon in that there's actually more of the launchers than the ammunition they use, with about 2,000 being built for only about 400 of the M338 warheads they fired. Testing and development of the Davy Crockett went on for over 10 years, with almost all of the test firing being done with dummy rounds. Only one actual M338 warhead named Little Feller was ever fired from a Davy Crockett launcher, and that was during a trial at the military's Nevada testing site, And this was actually the last atmospheric nuclear detonation ever made there. Now surprisingly, the Davy Crockett was actually issued in limited numbers to several different army battalions, with the idea being that it could help combat the Soviets and North Koreans, but thankfully, none were ever actually used. The last Davy Crockett launcher was retired in 1971, and since then, many of the surviving models can be found in various museums all across the US. But perhaps the best example of crazy weapons technology to come out of the Cold War era is from the mad scientist at Heckler & Koch. Heckler & Koch? Koch? I don't know. Which one is it? Echo? Who built the G36 assault rifle?
The Heckler & Koch G36 is an assault rifle that was designed by Heckler & Koch.
But perhaps the best example of crazy weapons technology to come out of the Cold War era is from the mad scientist at Heckler & Koch, who designed a caseless ammunition clockwork rifle called the G11. It was developed as H&K's entry for a proposal by NATO to create a gun that fired caseless ammunition. What that means is that rather than propellant being used in a separate housing from the projectile that is expelled, all those components are combined together. And in the case of the G11, or rather the lack of a case, the 4.73 by 33 millimeter projectile was put inside a block of propellant and held in place by a small plastic cap. It has similar ballistics to a typical 5.56 round, but it doesn't tumble or fragment quite as well, making it a bit less lethal. And to combat this, the G11 was designed to fire rounds in salvo bursts, meaning that rather than one round doing a lot of damage, you would just shoot a bunch of rounds that did a little bit of damage each. The G11 wasn't the first or only gun to experiment with the idea of caseless ammunition, but it stands out because of the Kraut space magic that made it work. When the gun is fired, excess gases cycle the rotating chamber, loading rounds from a vertically oriented magazine and turning them a full 90 degrees to line up with the barrel. The G11 has 3 firing modes, those being semi-auto, full auto at 460 rounds per minute, or a 3-round burst at a whopping 2,000 rounds per minute, or about 4.5 times faster than on full auto. This incredible burst fire speed was entirely due to the firing mechanism, which uses the recoil to drive nearly the entire internal mechanism backwards, including the barrel and magazine, allowing the gun to quickly cycle rounds before buffering. An external hand crank is used to literally wind up the gun like a clock, but it can also be used to expel bad rounds if the need arises. Now, despite the G11's incredibly complex design, it was by most accounts a pretty reliable, accurate, and comfortable weapon to shoot, and due to the internals of the gun being mostly sealed off from exposure, it didn't require a whole lot of maintenance, and it was estimated to be capable of reliably shooting about 6,000 rounds before needing any sort of service. Development of the G11 began as early as 1967, with upgrades and improvements to the design going on into the 90s. Around 256 different prototypes were built over the years, and the Bundeswehr eventually requested 300,000 of them to be made, but the project fell apart in 1992 with factors like the reunification of Germany and the G11's incompatibility with NATO standards, ultimately making the G11 an impractical weapon, leading H&K to develop a more conventional rifle project that eventually resulted in the G36. Now, going back a few centuries, we have an interesting gun from the 16 and 1700s called the Jailer's Key. As its name would imply, these were literally just old-fashioned keys that had hollow bodies and could be filled with a small amount of gunpowder and ammunition. Some were built with triggers and full firing mechanisms, while others simply had a touch hole that you'd put a match or a cigar to in order to fire. It's not really known how common these were, and many historians speculate that these key guns were more practical for making a loud noise to alert other guards in case of trouble, rather than do any sort of significant damage. There wasn't really a specific design for these, and it's more than likely that these keys were modified into guns individually, and in some cases were probably made by the guards themselves, if not just to pass the time. The TDI-KRISS Vector is a gun that a lot of you will probably recognize from the dozens of games and movies it's been in over the last 15 years, but I'd wager that not everyone realizes what exactly makes it stand out over other submachine guns of its class. For one, the lower receiver is mounted on only 4 pins, making it incredibly simple and easy to swap out between different calibers without needing any tools. But the Vector's main identifying feature is something called the Super V system that uses an inertia block to divert the recoil of the bolt at a downward angle, significantly decreasing upward climb and allowing for a very stable and sustained fire. The Vector also feeds off of Glock-style magazines, and it's built with modularity in mind, making it incredibly customizable to fit the user's needs and style. Several different versions of the Vector have been made for both the civilian market as well as military and police, and the development of the gun continues to this day, with KRISS announcing a 3.0 version of the Vector just earlier this year. Arguably one of the most significant rifle platforms ever made is the AR-15, and over the decades that it's been around, its incredible customizability has led to all sorts of mods and add-ons, sometimes even joining it with other completely different guns to make some sort of ballistic Frankenstein's monster. The AR-57 is the cross between a standard AR-15 and the FNP-90 submachine gun. Now, rather than a regular upper receiver with the T-shaped charging handle that feeds off of standard magazines, the AR-57 uses a special upper receiver chambered for 5.7 that feeds off of P90 stick mags. The AR-57 upper mounts to any standard AR lower, and at half the price of a P90, it's a good alternative for someone who wants a 5.7 carbine and already has an AR. There's not really much more to the AR-57, but I thought it was unique enough to be worth mentioning, and I think it fits perfectly on this level of the Iceberg. Now, arguably one of the most significant handguns ever made is the tried and true 1911. And this is not a 1911, it's actually a Star BM 9mm, but it's built the same exact way, so it's a good enough stand-in. Now I hear you say, but Brandy Buck, how is the 1911 weird? It's the basis by which literally hundreds of guns have been made, and it's the standard for what counts as a good handgun, and to that I say, you're right. But what if the 1911 shot 308 rifle rounds? The Springfield SASS was a short-lived system introduced in the 1980s that allowed anyone with a 1911 to convert their pistol into a single-shot, long-range handgun that was chambered in various high-caliber rounds. The idea was that a 1911 could be quickly converted into what was basically a stockless rifle for hunters, backpackers, or survivalists. Now, the SASS replaced the entire upper portion of the gun and required a special mechanism to be installed in the magazine well that would open the breech to extract and load the rounds. Now, obviously the big draw to the SASS compared to other single-shot rifle caliber pistols was that it was a glorified add-on for a gun that many people already had. But that said, the SASS wasn't a huge success and quickly fell out of production. The lack of the SASS's popularity is mostly due to the fact that handguns aren't necessarily designed for rifle power rounds, and while the 1911 certainly has a sturdy frame, I can't imagine it was too comfortable to shoot anyway. Aside from that, chances are that people who had a 1911 and partook in outdoor activities like target shooting and hunting probably already had a rifle anyway, eliminating the need for a gimmicky add-on for their sidearm. And while gimmicky guns have certainly been around since long before the SASS and are certainly still around today, it remains one of the weirdest, albeit short-lived chapters in the 1911's incredible legacy. But that incredible legacy owes itself largely to our next entry if you trace the rabbit trail back far enough. Before the time-tested semi-automatic cartridge fire mechanisms of modern handguns, plenty of gunsmiths came up with a lot of ideas for reliably holding and firing multiple shots. And beyond even the first self-loading handguns and modern revolvers, there was the Volcanic Repeater. Now, aside from being the gun that led to the development of the Winchester lever-action rifle, the Volcanic Repeater was also one of the earliest examples of caseless ammunition. The gun was designed by Walter Hunt as a solution to the need for a simplified and more efficient type of ammunition compared to the tedious multi-step process of loading a gun at the time. For the sake of explanation, black powder guns at the time had to be loaded in a very specific order. You had to load your powder, and then your wad, and then your ball, and then another wad or a piece of paper, and then you had to open the cock, put in a cap. It took a long time, and it was a big process. And while skilled gunmen could easily do this process pretty quickly, it took a lot of training, and in the eyes of Walter Hunt, could be done better. And while early breech loaders allowed the shooter to load an entire paper cartridge into the gun much quicker than having to force everything down the barrel in sequence, this only solved part of the problem. You still had to carry a whole bunch of supplies on you to load the gun. You needed caps, powder, wads, bullets, cartridge paper, wax, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Walter Hunt developed what he called the rocket ball cartridge, which simplified bullet design to where the projectile itself was its own casing, with the majority of the bullet actually being hollow and filled with powder, and then sealed off with an ignition cap in the back. Walter Hunt also designed a new mechanism to fire this rocket ball cartridge using a network of internal linkages to cycle the bolt using the pivoting motion of a lever attached to the trigger guard. This design was adapted and improved by various gunsmiths until eventually coming to the attention of a businessman named Cortland Palmer, who would actually give the task of manufacturing a successful gun to two inventors by the name of Horace Smith and Daniel B. Wesson. Together, the two men started the Volcanic Repeating Arms Company and began producing the first lever-action firearm, the Volcanic carbine. As Horace and Dan continued manufacturing the guns, things started to get a little out of hand, and they were starting to run out of money despite the fact that these guns were proving to be a pretty commercial success. Luckily for them, a different American businessman saw their potential and decided to help them out. And that man was Oliver Winchester, who became the principal stockholder of Volcanic Arms and pushed to move production to New Haven, Connecticut. At this point, both Smith and Wesson decided to leave the company and found their own, and Winchester, upon relocating, renamed the company to New Haven Arms and eventually Winchester Repeating Firearms. Now, contrary to how it's often depicted in media, the Volcanic Repeater is actually pretty underpowered, with its ballistic performance being beaten by something as small as 25 ACP. But all the same, it was monumental in the development of firearms technology moving forward by laying the ground for several principles still used today and also having a part to play in the development of firearm juggernauts Winchester Repeating Firearms and Smith & Wesson, who is almost synonymous with revolvers today. Now, if I tell you to picture a revolver, most people are probably going to imagine a pretty stereotypical six-shooter like the ones made by Colt or Smith & Wesson. And this makes sense because this general style of revolver is one that's worked for millions of people all over the world for centuries. But that's not to say that other designs haven't popped up over the years to varying degrees of success and popularity, and in the case of the Chiappa Rhino, that's because of what makes it different. The basics of the Rhino are more or less standard for a revolver in that it feeds off of a 6-round cylinder, fires in single or double action, and comes in a variety of sizes and calibers, but it has some very interesting mechanical features that set it apart. For one, the external hammer on the back of the gun isn't actually a hammer at all, and it's merely a linkage handle connected to an internal hammer that the shooter can use to manually charge the action, but it doesn't actually reciprocate when being fired. The Rhino was built with precision and simplicity in mind, with almost every part of the gun being made on a CNC machine to guarantee that the parts fit together with minimal tolerances and to cut down on the bulk and mass of external moving parts. They also come with built-in accessory rails for lights, lasers, or optics, which is something you don't typically see as much on revolvers. But the Rhino's biggest identifying feature is the orientation of the barrel. As opposed to how most revolvers fire off of the cylinder's top chamber, the Rhino actually fires off of the bottom. This aligns the recoil of the shot more level with the shooter's wrist rather than above it, reducing muzzle flip and allowing them to regain a stable sight picture much quicker, although the barrel being much lower than the sights can cause some issues at extreme close range. The Rhino's made a pretty decent impact in the 2010s as a cool futuristic gun in several films and games, and with such a unique look all on its own, it's easy to see why. But a cool looking revolver with unique features is nothing new, and one such wheel gun comes from all the way back during the Civil War, the LeMat Revolver. Also called the Grape Shot Revolver, the LeMat was designed in 1856 by New Orleans manufacturer Jean-Alexandre LeMat for service in the Confederate Army. They were mainly produced in Belgium and France and saw some use in the Franco-Prussian War as well. The LeMat revolver was designed with a unique cylinder that could hold 9 rounds, allowing the user to fire off 3 extra shots compared to a typical 6-round revolver. This was mostly a feature of necessity since the cylinder was expanded outward to make room for a secondary smoothbore barrel in the center, allowing more area on the cylinder to fit those 3 extra chambers. This secondary smoothbore barrel was used as a compact shotgun and could be loaded with small pellets of grape shot, from where the LeMat gets its nickname. Now, contrary to other typical multi-barrel designs, the LeMat does not use double triggers or double hammers or some sort of 2-stage firing mechanism. All there is to it is a small switch on the hammer itself that moves the striker from aligning with the cylinder to the primer on the lower barrel. Now, weirdly enough, the LeMat isn't often depicted in media firing the shotgun barrel, and it's usually just shown as a regular revolver, although it is shown properly in a few more recent video games like Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, Jean LeMat designed the revolver with the intention of it seeing service with mounted cavalry soldiers, with those extra 3 shots and optional shotgun barrels serving as an advantage for shooting on horseback. The Confederate Army contracted LeMat for 5,000 revolvers, but only half of them made it through the Union Army's naval blockade on their way over from Europe. But those that did make it to the hands of the Southern soldiers saw a good amount of use by several notable Southern officers, like Stonewall Jackson, Braxton Bragg, and Jeb Stuart, although most cavalry soldiers kept to the old way of carrying multiple pistols on horseback. When early cartridge fire technology started to show up in the late 1800s, updated versions of the LeMat were designed for both pinfire rounds and early centerfire cartridges, but neither saw as much popularity as the older black powder versions. Now, I've seen a couple different revolvers sometimes misidentified as the LeMat, those being the Henrion, Dassy, and Heuschen revolver, the Lefaucheux over and under, and the L'Explorateur Mitraille. Similar to the LeMat, all 3 of these guns are double-barrel revolvers with an oversized, high-capacity cylinder, but none have a shotgun capability and, depending on the round they're chambered in, can hold anywhere from 10 to 20 shots. In the case of the HDH and the Lefaucheux, the rounds sit in the cylinder in 2 offset circles, with each cocking of the hammer and pull of the trigger alternating fire between the 2 levels, firing out of either the top or bottom barrel. The L'Explorateur, on the other hand, has 2 side-by-side barrels that fire off at once, essentially making the 12-round pistol still function as a 6-round. And yes, it is firing 2 bullets at once, but since the gun is chambered in 6mm, you'd probably still be better off shooting a classic 6-shot 45 anyway. But weirdly designed high-capacity revolvers aren't just something from the earlier days of cartridge fire, because in 1958, a man named David Dardick patented his unique design for a double-action, open-chamber, magazine-fed revolver that uses proprietary triangular plastic cartridges called T-rounds or Trounds. The concept of a triangular bullet casing was something that the US military had been exploring for a few years before Dardick, with the thinking being that since triangles are more geometrically efficient than circles, the principle could be applied to a new type of ammunition that would take up about half the storage space for the same amount of rounds. But getting machine guns to fire triangles proved incredibly difficult, and the idea was abandoned by the military, only to be later picked up by Dardick. The pistol he designed for the T-rounds had a 3-chamber cylinder with open U-shaped chambers that was fed ammo by an internal magazine housed within the grip. The T-rounds were made in the shape of an equilateral triangle and perfectly fit the contour of the chambers, so it didn't really matter what side they went in first. When firing the Dardick revolver, the first chamber would rotate across the magazine and pick up a T-round before rotating it to the top, lining up with the barrel, and firing. On the next trigger pull, the cylinder would rotate again, spitting out the spent shell from the right side and moving the next chamber into position to do the same thing all over again. It was certainly an odd design, but it technically worked, so what happened? Well, for one, the T-rounds were incredibly expensive compared to traditional cartridges, and since they would only fire out of the Dardick revolver, you had to get both to be able to use either. Dardick did address this by designing T-round adapters to hold regular ammunition, and since the outside dimensions of the plastic casing stay the same, he provided multiple caliber options and created interchangeable barrels to accommodate. As you can probably imagine, the Dardick revolver was too unusual and complicated for potential customers, and it ended up being a commercial failure. And while Dardick did experiment with different models of the gun, like a carbine and the 20-round variant, not a whole lot of people really cared, and the gun ceased production in 1962. Dardick also made a few other experimental gun designs in the 70s, with his most successful actually being a type of boring drill. The Terra drill, as it was called, uses modified T-rounds to blast a salvo of 4 ceramic bullets into rock, using the concussive force to create constructive interference that allows the drill to pass through the rock more easily. And how Dardick went from modifying experimental machine gun ammo to shooting a bunch of small rocks at a bigger rock is a weird path to go down, but it's definitely interesting and probably something many of you didn't actually know. The last wacky revolver I want to talk about for this level of the Iceberg is not only one that is certainly different, but also one that was in fact dangerous, not only to the person in front of the barrel, but also whoever was actually shooting the gun, and really anybody who happened to be standing nearby. And I'll give you a second to figure out why. So this specific gun is the Cochran Turret Gun, but there were several different firearms made with the same concept. The turret revolver was a less common type of revolver from the early days of multi-shot guns. One of the biggest issues with early black powder revolvers was the risk of chain fire, which was when the ignition of the powder in one cylinder could potentially set off the powder in all the other cylinders, and while this isn't quite as problematic when the cylinders are all still pointing downrange, it's definitely a problem when they're all facing every direction around the shooter, including directly back at them. Turret-style revolvers have in some cases been successful or at least less dangerous, a good example being the Turbiaux Palm-Squeezer I talked about earlier, but those use cartridge ammunition, so the chances of one round accidentally setting off the rest are basically non-existent. Now you'd think that the guys who designed this thing would have thought about such a glaringly dangerous flaw in the gun, but the horizontal style of the drum was one of many ways that different gunsmiths tried to get around the design patent that Samuel Colt had on revolvers at the time. Thankfully though, turret-style revolvers saw very little success, making the few that remain today extremely rare and a neat thing to see if you get the chance. Now, as you should know by now, gunsmiths have been trying to figure out the best way for guns to hold more shots since the first Chinese guy stuck some sulfur down a tube of bamboo. In the earlier days, it was difficult to provide extra shots without adding significant weight and bulk to the gun, so people had to get creative. And one concept for allowing more shots in a rifle came from across the pond in 1854 as the Treeby Chain Gun. Now, rather than holding ammunition in a cylinder like a revolver, the chain gun, as its name would imply, held rounds in a series of individual chambers all linked together in a chain and cycled through the gun using a hand-cranked sprocket. This rifle was capable of holding up to 30 of these cylinders, but due to the cumbersome nature of the gun and its very complicated operation, it never made it past the prototype stage, and only 2 were ever actually built. Thankfully though, the arrival of brass case cartridges solved the problem of providing practical and efficient ammunition, and ever since Hiram Burden and Edward Boxer perfected the concept of centerfire cartridges as we know it today, almost every gun made since uses that style of ammunition. This allowed gun technology to quickly advance in the early 20th century, and with the 2 world wars driving a lot of need for good weaponry, we also started to see a lot of special purpose firearms. When we think of a war, we most likely imagine 2 forces facing off with each other, loudly blasting bullets and artillery back and forth until one side is dead enough or gives up. But sometimes things needed to be a lot more quiet, up close, and personal. The Welrod is a bolt-action, internally suppressed pistol designed for British and American intelligence agencies in 1942, and it has been used in numerous covert operations ever since. Often regarded as one of the quietest guns ever made, the Welrod averages at around 73 decibels, with the noise barely distinguishable as a gunshot past 15 feet. This was due to the unique design of the internal suppressor, which was made up of a rear expansion chamber followed by 14 metal baffles offset by 3 rubber discs that sealed back over the barrel when the rounds passed through, which significantly reduced the amount of gases and therefore noise that came out. The Welrod was designed with a cutaway muzzle that could allow it to be effectively fired in contact with the target, but its effective range went out to about 25 yards. 2 models of the Welrod were designed, but confusingly, the Mark II was actually the first to be produced, followed by the Mark I, which had more safety features and ergonomic upgrades. The Welrod is fed by a detachable box magazine that doubles as the grip, and ammunition is fed one at a time by rotating a knob on the back 90 degrees and pulling backwards, feeding it around, and then sliding it back closed. Around 14,000 Welrod pistols were made, with some being dropped into German-occupied areas to arm resistance fighters. However, the Welrod wasn't the only handgun dropped behind enemy lines to arm resistance forces during World War II, and the gun that is perhaps better known for this is the FP-45 Liberator. The whole idea behind the Liberator was for insurgents to be able to acquire a better gun, with the thinking being that they would use the Liberator for killing Nazis and then take their weapons. The guns would be distributed in a box with instructions for use, 10 rounds of ammo, and a dowel to help push out spent casings. The government contracted the General Motors Guide Lamp Division to build the guns because somehow making headlights for cars translates well to making weapons for freedom fighters, and around 1 million Liberators were produced to be distributed all across Europe and the Pacific Theater. However, President Eisenhower didn't really think there was a lot of value to the idea, and ultimately, only around 25,000 were ever dropped by American forces, with 450,000 more being sent to the British OSS, who also distributed them in small numbers before disposing of the rest by melting them for scrap or dumping them in the ocean. Now, while the FP-45 Liberator did technically work and was definitely a gun, it also had some value as a weapon of psychological warfare. It was theorized that with such large quantities of the guns being dropped into a specific area, the occupying enemy forces wouldn't be able to track down and confiscate them all, leaving the very good chance that a significant number of embittered citizens were hiding them and could strike out at any moment. Now you might be wondering, wouldn't dropping thousands of guns and rounds of ammunition into enemy territory be kind of counterintuitive to the war effort? Well, the designers of the Liberator had this in mind. The gun was not intended to be used long-term or at long range, with its crude construction and smooth-bore barrel only being good for about 50 shots, and it was only effective to about 3 yards. The jagged and cheaply built frame was also rather unpleasant to shoot and could even cut the user's hand if they weren't wearing gloves. It was also deliberately chambered in .45 ACP, not only because most American small arms already used that round, meaning there was no need for new manufacturing, but .45 ACP was almost a strictly American round that no one else really used at the time, so there was no point in Germans holding on to the ammo if all they had to use was a Liberator. Like I said, the whole point of the gun was to give insurgents a quick and simple tool to overpower a German soldier and take his weapon, then be thrown away. That is, of course, assuming the user actually had enough time to fire the gun, because the process was tedious to say the least, and it was often joked that it took longer to load and fire a Liberator than it did to actually manufacture them in a factory. The gun was primed by pulling back on the rear knob and twisting it to expose the breech. You would then load a single round into the chamber, seat the breech block over it, and close the knob back in place. Then you just pulled the trigger and hopefully hit your target. If for some reason you wanted or needed to fire it again, you would need to use the supplied wooden dowel to push out the spent casing before loading it again. The GM Guide Lamp division did also produce an extremely crude and simplified version of the 1911 that was made of stamped steel and was proposed to serve the same purpose as the Liberator. It was made with no slide lock, the magazine was held in place by a tension rod on the bottom of the grip, and the only form of safety was the rear sight that could be twisted down to block off the hammer. These stamped 1911s ended up being a total failure since they were significantly more complex and expensive than Liberators, and they weighed over 3 pounds when loaded, which is more than an actual 1911 weighs. The Guide Lamp division did eventually have a successful gun that saw a significant amount of use, however, that being the iconic M3 grease gun. But for every iconic American weapon from World War II, there's one that wasn't quite as well known. A gun like the M1 Garand didn't just show up one day as the standard issue rifle of American forces, it had to beat out several other contenders, one of those being the M1941 Johnson. This rifle was designed by Melvin Johnson as a prospective new semi-automatic battle rifle for the military, but by the time the gun was complete and ready for consideration, it was already too late. But while being overshadowed by the much more capable Garand, the Johnson rifle still saw some limited use, with several American troops who used them unofficially after taking them from an undelivered shipment that never made it to the Dutch, who had contracted a few thousand of the Johnson rifles for use in the Pacific. And despite the Johnson never actually being officially adopted by the US military, there's a pretty good amount of its recorded use. Major Robert Dunlap is one notable American soldier who famously used a Johnson rifle in Iwo Jima, and his actions there resulted in him being rewarded with the Medal of Honor. The Johnson rifle uses an internally mounted rotary magazine to load ammo, and the reciprocating barrel feeds rounds using the gun's recoil, which ultimately made it much less sturdier than other rifles in its class and also made it impossible to effectively use bayonets with. The one big advantage the Johnson had over rifles like the Garand was that the magazine could be topped off by just loading new rounds into the side gate. But like I said, it wasn't as sturdy or resistant to the elements like the Garand, and that's a big reason why it wasn't chosen. But Melvin Johnson did have a different rifle that the military higher-ups were actually quite fond of, that being his 1941 Johnson machine gun. This gun was in many ways similar to the German FG-42, as both operated in very much the same way and served the same purpose, which was a multi-purpose rifle for paratroopers. It also kept several design elements of the Johnson rifle, most notably the load gate on the right side that the user could feed loose rounds or stripper clips into to top off the magazine. The Johnson machine gun was several pounds lighter than the BAR and could quickly be broken down and reassembled, which I'm sure was attractive to guys who had to jump out of planes with them. It also had an adjustable rate of fire capable of 200 to 600 rounds per minute. The Johnson machine gun saw use during both World War II and the Korean Syrian War up to the 60s, and it was even adopted by the Israeli military, who made their own version chambered in .303 British called the Drawer. But with all the moving external parts, it didn't work too well with all the sand and dust, so the Drawer didn't last very long. One of the most notable users of the Johnson machine gun was actually Che Guevara, who infamously used one throughout the Cuban Revolution. Melvin Johnson continued his career as a gunsmith all the way until his death in 1965, and he was involved in the early development of the AR-15 as well as the .22 Spitfire cartridge, which was basically a .30 carbine casing necked down for a .57 bullet. So obviously the post-World War II era was ripe for new and interesting designs for firearms, and the Americans weren't the only ones doing this. While big rifles still had their place, there was an increasing need for soldiers and police to have small, compact personal defense weapons that could be used quickly and efficiently in close quarters situations. Poland's solution to this was the Pistolet Maszynowy 63 rack. Despite the rather common misconception that RAK stands for Ręczny Automat Komandosów, or Automatic Commando Pistol, it isn't actually an acronym, and it's just the Polish word meaning either crustacean or cancer, like the constellation. According to one hypothesis, the PM63 was nicknamed the RAK because of its designer, Piotr Wielniewicz. Take that, Brandon Herrera.
It was designed by a man by the name of
Piotr Wielniewicz.
By the name of
Piotr Wielniewicz.
Jesus, Poland, can I buy a vowel?
Wielniewicz died of cancer during the gun's development, and it's been speculated that the nickname of RAK was made in reference to him, which in a somewhat morbid way makes a little bit more sense because calling the gun the Machine Pistol 63 Automatic Commando Pistol is just too much. The gun was designed to bridge the gap between a standard self-loading pistol and a fully automatic submachine gun, and it honestly does exactly that pretty well. It's also one of the few new submachine guns issued to soldiers and police in Eastern Europe during the Soviet era. The PM63 saw extensive use by Polish military special forces as well as police, and it continues to be used today in a lot of the no-no countries. The PM63 works by using a select fire straight blowback operation and fires from an open bolt. Typical with compact PDW-style machine pistols, the PM63 also has a collapsible buttstock and folding foregrip, and it can be carried in a holster much like a normal pistol. The select fire is also atypical for most submachine guns in that there's not actually any sort of selector, and the fire mode depends on how much you press the progressive two-stage trigger. The first position makes the gun fire on semi-automatic, and a full send fires it on full auto. One feature more like a standard semi-auto handgun and less like a typical submachine gun is that the bolt is part of an external slide, meaning that you have a big chunk of steel sliding back and forth right by your cheek when firing, which I'm sure takes a little getting used to. The slide also contains an inertia buffer that helps maintain a consistent fire rate of 650 rounds per minute on automatic fire, and a protrusion of the slide extends over the front of the barrel, operating as a sort of reciprocating compensator to help steady the offset of recoil. This compensator can also be used to rack the slide. Now this can be a little problematic because it's possible to move the slide just far back enough to chamber around while not engaging the sear, which is crucial in keeping the gun from firing until the trigger is pulled. While there's not been any confirmed cases that I could find, one could theoretically pull the gun from the holster, charge the gun by pushing the compensator protrusion against their thigh, but not push the slide all the way, causing the gun to slam fire around into their leg. Which just goes to prove the point that you should never point a gun at anything you aren't willing to destroy, especially your own femoral artery. Like I said, close quarters urban warfare was becoming an increasingly common worry for lots of people during the Cold War, and after the 1972 Summer Olympics massacre in Munich, the German police realized they needed a rifle they could use to engage long-range targets from close quarters areas. To address this need, Walther Arms designed a semi-automatic bullpup sniper rifle called the WA-2000. It was built with a detachable scope mount for quickly swapping between various size optics, which was something that the HK-G3 rifles used by Germany at the time couldn't do, and this had a big part to play in the police's inability to effectively engage the terrorists in Munich. The WA-2000 performed well during testing, but due to the gun's price of around $10,000 in the early 80s, it proved far too expensive for many potential customers. It was also considered to be somewhat delicate for military use despite its incredible craftsmanship, so it didn't make much of an impact and only around 175 guns were ever produced. But despite this, the unique look of the WA-2000 has led to it appearing in various forms of media, and it's perhaps best known as Agent 47's go-to weapon in the early Hitman games. Ultimately, H&K would also develop their PSG sniper rifle for the same purpose as the WA-2000, and it's gone on to be known as the most accurate semi-automatic rifle ever made. Again, Kraut space magic, am I right? The last gun we're going to look at on this level of the iceberg is another unique looking bullpup that made its rounds as a futuristic stand-in before gaining wider popularity, and this one comes from the crackhead mad scientists at Kel Tec Firearms, the KSG. You may recognize this shotgun by its appearance in things like the John Wick movies and a host of video games, but this gun is not actually some special military grade weapon, and chances are there's one for sale at your local sporting goods store right now. Kel Tec guns are a hit or miss for a lot of people, and there's long been a joke that Kel Tec's engineers are on drugs when creating their guns, and looking at some of their designs, it's easy to see why one might think that. But despite that, the KSG has seen a good amount of positive reception and is used by a lot of people as a pretty decent personal defense weapon. While some might assume that the KSG is a double barrel shotgun, it actually only has one barrel and feeds off of twin magazine tubes. This allows a whopping 14+1 capacity and the potential to fire 2 different loads out of the same gun without having to reload. For example, you could load the left tube with buckshot and the right tube with slugs, and use the switch on the loading gate to swap back and forth as needed. There's been several different iterations of the KSG, including a more compact model with only one magazine tube, as well as one with extended tubes that bring the load capacity to an insane 25 rounds, which for a pump-action shotgun is a lot. For comparison, my Maverick 88 only holds 8 rounds, and look how long it is. This is why the bullpup design was a big draw for the KSG, because it still allows for a full-size 18.5-inch barrel while still holding way more ammo and having only about 60% of the total overall length of your typical pump-action shotgun. And with that, we have come to the end of the first level of the Weird Gun Iceberg. This is of course just the start of some of the bizarre guns out there, so be sure to stay tuned for the next video when I look at a few more. I'd love to know which gun you thought was the weirdest of this bunch, so let me know in the comments. Whether you're a gun nut like me or just wanted to learn about some weird stuff, I'm glad you were here to watch this video, and if you stayed all the way to the end, just know that you've hit the bullseye of my heart. Until next time, stay locked and loaded for what comes next, and I'll see you all downrange. Goodbye, everyone.